Among the great continents of the earth, none has been more lavishly endowed with natural wealth and beauty than has South America, which embraces over 1/8 of the Earth's land area and only a little more than 3% of the world's population. Brazil itself is larger than the whole of the United States, and it has millions of acres of land that no white man has ever seen.
When thinking of the beginning of cinema as an art form, most people probably think of old Hollywood and France and the associated filmmakers, such as the Lumiere brothers, Griffith, or Hitchcock. While all these individuals were greatly influential in the formation of cinema as we know it today, the lens in which most individuals perceive cinema comes from a Western perspective. There are many countries with prolific film industries that have been forgotten by this Western narrative. An example of this is Brazil. While other Latin countries like Mexico have had more mainstream success in the US, Brazil has been largely excluded from the conversation. I will be analyzing the early Brazilian film industry through time and discuss why this national cinema has been largely ignored in the United States. Brazilian cinema was recognized by the rest of the world at different points in time, though its height of international recognition occurred with Cinema Novo, a movement that occurred in the 1960s and 70s. Most film history education doesn't cover Brazilian cinema, and most people probably know very little about Brazilian films. One could attribute the lack of American knowledge of Brazilian cinema and culture to cultural neocolonialism. As a result, it's not surprising to learn that the Brazilian film industry actually had an early start. The first film screenings in Brazil occurred in 1896, just 6 months after the first screening by the Lumiere brothers in Paris. Afonso Segreto, an Italo-Brazilian, began making films in 1898. Starting in 1900, local films grew to dominate local Brazilian screens. When the industrialization of energy occurred in Rio in 1901, the number of exhibition halls grew tremendously. The first very popular Brazilian movie was called Os Estranguladores, directed by Antônio Leal in 1908. In this decade, the Brazilian film industry operated as a vertically integrated system, from production to exhibition. Popular genres included sung films where singers performed behind the screen, satirical films such as Paz e Amor, novelistic adaptations such as A Cabana de Pai Tomás, carnival films such as O Cordão, and historical dramas like A República Portuguesa. This prolific time period was coined the Belle Époque, or Golden Age. Local production reached around 100 short films per year, a very impressive number. Throughout the Belle Époque, the Brazilian film industry was thriving. Unfortunately, this came to an end when North American businessmen entered the Brazilian market in 1911, beginning the foreign takeover of the Brazilian film market. These foreign films became the standard, resulting in more artistic Brazilian films becoming less desirable. The lack of infrastructure in Brazil compared to other countries made the exhibition of foreign films a more guaranteed profit. This foreign takeover was commonplace in this time period and was only an additional way to utilize Western hegemony. Economic hegemony is what allowed the initial takeover, but this led to cultural hegemony, stripping Brazilians of their own local traditions within the art form of cinema. Despite this Western dominance, some Brazilian filmmakers still prevailed. Luiz de Barros adapted novels and movies like A Viuvinha. Gilberto Rossi and other immigrants continued to develop infrastructure for production of features through working on newsreels, documentaries, and political propaganda. After filmmakers were trained in this system, Rossi and others began producing feature films like José Medina's Exemplo Regenerador and Fragmentos da Vida. In the 1920s, the Brazilian film industry developed in regional cycles, usually away from urban centers, including in Rio Grande do Sul, Recife, Manaus, Cataguases, and Campinas. Some prominent filmmakers included Silvinho Santos from Manaus, Edson Chagas and Gentil Ruiz from Recife, and Humberto Mauro from Cataguases. Humberto Mauro is one of the most important Brazilian filmmakers from this time period. Some film historians consider him the most important precursor of Cinema Novo. Independent filmmaking in Brazil leaned toward avant-garde film. One film specifically, Limite, from 1930, directed by 18-year-old Mario Peixoto, was not widely seen at the time of its release, but has grown to gain recognition as one of the most significant films in the history of Brazilian cinema. Limite was inspired by French avant-garde, and it was not the only film to be inspired by foreign influences. Parody was surprisingly used, as filmmakers could use parody to mock foreign films while also mocking their own inability to imitate the big production values and simultaneously exploiting the success of these films. This development is another sign of the Brazilian film industry's fortitude and willingness to adapt in order to survive. Brazil also had its own unique film genre. As sound pictures became the norm, a new challenge emerged for the Hollywood films being shown in Brazil, as the natives spoke Portuguese. This resulted in the industrialization of the Brazilian film industry, with Ademir Gonzaga founding Cinedia Studios in Rio. This eventually led to the markedly Brazilian genre of the chanchada to form. This genre is based on the Hollywood Review and backstage musicals, merged with typical Brazilian comedic theater and, of course, Carnival. As foreign film industries are often forgotten, so are the contributions of women. Women have had a major impact in early Brazilian cinema. Carmen Santos started as an actress but then became a producer. She then founded Brasil Vita Filme, a studio under direction of Humberto Mauro. In 1948, she wrote, produced, directed, and starred in Inconfidência Mineira. Gilda de Abreu was another talented woman, who in 1946 wrote, directed, and co-produced O Brio, a very popular melodrama which had 500 copies made, a record in Brazil. Carmen Miranda is definitely the most famous Brazilian involved in the film industry in this time period. She was a star at Cinedia Studios. She also had a fondness for Hollywood that resulted in a wave of Brazilian-themed American films that functioned as an arm of the good neighbor policy. Carmen Miranda's rise to fame in Hollywood is probably the most notable influence and recognition that Brazil earned during this time period. Unfortunately, her popularity promulgated stereotypes and facilitated U.S. dominance over Brazil on the world stage. Clearly, Brazil had a vibrant film industry that remained generally underground in the context of international cinema. Even in modern times, Brazilian cinema doesn't really have a place in the general American repertoire, despite being one of the largest countries in the world and arguably the most influential in South America. Brazil had its own golden age, the Belle Époque, until foreign investors came in and took over the film industry from Brazilians. The locals persisted, mostly through production of other media, until infrastructure allowed them to start making features themselves. These films were inspired by foreign influences, and they were mostly avant-garde, laying the foundations for Cinema Novo in the 60s and 70s, Brazil's most popular film movement. Other films were parodies or Brazil's very own unique genre, the chanchada. Despite women being important in Brazil's film industry, the most famous woman, Carmen Miranda, was utilized through her involvement in Hollywood films to push American foreign policy goals. All the developments that occurred in the Brazilian film industry demonstrate that Western hegemony was able to keep the industry relatively unexplored by American audiences to this day, which is unfortunate as early Brazilian cinema has a lot to offer.